welcome back to London Running PT. Today we are talking about the deep squat. Why are we talking about the deep squat? Well, this video has been inspired by a few patients that have come to see me recently. And these patients are specifically coming to see me because they are struggling to get into the deep squat position. So these are not patients that are coming to see me because they're in pain. They're coming to see me because they cannot get into a deep squat, and their goals for coming to see me is for me to help them do that. The reason I think I'm seeing more and more of these patients coming through the doors is probably due to the popularity of exercise programs such as CrossFit. But what I'm finding interesting is the different reasons that I'm hearing. So for example, people will come into me and they'll say, Terry, the reason I can't get into my deep squat is because I think I've got poor core stability. Or they'll say that I believe I can't get into my deep squat position because I'm really tight through my thoracic spine, or I've got really restricted motion in my shoulders. So what that is really telling me is that people haven't got a clear understanding of what the important restrictions are when it comes to a deep squat, and also really understanding the deep squat. So this is the purpose of this video, is to dispel a few myths, because I do not believe that your inability to get into a deep squat position has anything to do with core stability, and I certainly don't think restriction in the thoracic spine and shoulders are major problems. They can contribute, of course, but they're not the major restrictions. For me, the major restrictions that stop people getting into a deep squat position are going to be around the hip and the ankle. So specifically, they're going to be restrictions into hip flexion, hip abduction, and hip external rotation, and also into ankle dorsiflexion. They are the major restrictions that I see, and we're going to work through that and look at a few videos which highlights that really well. What we're also going to do is look a little bit deeper at the deep squat. So to truly understand the deep squat, then you must understand this simple interplay between gravity, center of mass, and base of support. And if you understand how those things interplay and interrelate to each other, then you'll really understand the deep squat. And this is why I'm putting it out on the website, London Running PT, is that running is also very similar. So running in a very simplified way is this simple interplay between gravity, base of support, and center of mass. And if you understand that, then you'll understand human locomotion. So this is where we're going to start this video. Okay, so let's have a look at the first of these three variables that we're interested in, which in this case is gravity. So it's one of those things that is obviously incredibly important, but I think it's often forgotten about because it's something that we can't see, so it's not obviously there. But it's really important to know that in the deep squat, also in running this is true, that gravity is absolutely key to understanding both of those things. So as I'm sure you know, gravity is consistently pushing down on us, and having to overcome that force is essential to human locomotion, and it's also essential to understanding the deep squat. So all we really need to understand with gravity is it's a constant force pushing down at us at 9.81 meters per second squared, and there's not really too much that you can do about it. So when we talk about the other variables, there's slight things that we can change there. We can manipulate those a little bit, but gravity, it is what it is. We can't change it, but it is vitally important to understand that it's there and to acknowledge its importance. So the next variable we're interested in is your base of support. So your base of support when you're thinking about the deep squat is your feet tend to be set in this position, so they're slightly more than shoulder width apart. It's okay to have your feet turned out slightly, that's absolutely fine. In terms of the base of support and what we're interested in, your base of support is that area between your 2 feet. So in this picture, it's that green shaded area. And unlike gravity, we can do something about your base of support. So intuitively, if you move your foot further apart or your feet further apart, you're going to increase your base of support, which is obviously why when you stand with your feet further apart, you're much more stable. So it's harder to push you over because you've increased your base of support. Interestingly, with running, your base of support, because running is just one leg, your base of support is basically the length and width of 1 foot. So in running, your base of support is much less, which is why, for example, when you stand on one leg rather than two, it's less stable because you've got a much smaller base of support. So the third variable we're interested in is your center of mass. So you can see from this diagram or this picture that your center of mass in human beings is roughly around about where your belly button is, just above your pelvis. And your center of mass is an important thing to understand when it comes to running, and also when it comes to understanding your deep squat. So put very simply, your center of mass has to stay within your base of support, and if it does not stay within your base of support, you will fall over. It's that simple. So when you're going into a deep squat, your body is constantly trying to maneuver your center of mass so it stays within your base of support, so it stays within that green area. If it comes out of that green area, then you're going to fall over. And it's a similar kind of thing with running. So all running is really, in a very simplified way, is as you throw yourself forward onto your foot, i.e. your base of support, you have to get your center of mass over your foot, and then you propel yourself and throw yourself onto your next foot. So let's look at a deep squat in action. So this is Mario, and Mario you'll be familiar with if you saw my Hill Circuits video. So Mario was the guy in the Hill Circuits video, and this little snippet was taken on the same day, which is why the weather looks amazing here and it's not going to look as good in subsequent videos. But Mario's a CrossFitter, so he's a high intensity guy, does lots of CrossFit, and he's pretty good at the deep squat position. So let's look at what a deep squat should look like. So we'll play it slow motion, and we'll see as Mario hits that end of range position. That's a pretty good deep squat position. So what we're looking for is trunk is relatively upright. Yeah, he's leaning forward a little bit, but you can imagine if he's got a barbell across here holding that in his hands, he's going to be able to keep that barbell nicely above his head. Now the secret to Mario's success, the reason he can get into this position, is that he can keep his center of mass, which remember is around about there, within his base of support, which remember is around about there. The reason he can do that and his key to success is he's got really good range of motion, and he's got really good range of motion specifically in his hips. So if we look at hip flexion, for example, then we're kind of looking through that angle there. So the more hip flexion he will have, the more acute that angle will be. So the smaller the angle, the more hip flexion he'll have. And the fact that he's got such good hip flexion is his key to success here, which is why he can get into this position. It's also important to remember when you're looking at hip flexion to make sure that the hip flexion is coming from the hip joint itself and not from any cheap movements like posterior rotation of the pelvis, because sometimes people can use that as a way to get an extra hip flexion, which is sometimes called a butt wink. But this is a pretty decent deep squat. Okay, so let's have a look at the other end of the spectrum. So this is me about to go into my deep squat position, and I'm sure once the video plays you will be able to see a very subtle difference between myself and Mario in terms of the position that we end up in. So let me just play the video. So as I'm coming down, you can see my trunk is going further and further forwards, and the lower I go, the further forwards my trunk goes until I end up in this position, which I'm sure you can see a slight difference between myself and Mario, and I'm sure you'll agree that is a pretty pathetic deep squat position. So if you imagine I had a barbell in my hands now, that is going to be very difficult to keep the barbell in that position. So if that barbell's got any weight on it whatsoever, I'm going to drop it by now. So it's a pretty pathetic deep squat position. However, if we understand center of mass, base of support, both my position and Mario's position are the same in that my body has kept my center of mass, round about there, within my base of support. So it's achieved the same goals, but because of my restrictions, my body position looks like this compared to Mario's. So let's kind of take that back a little bit and start again. So if we go right back to the beginning, the aim of what I'm looking for in the deep squat is I've got my barbell across here. It's nicely positioned at the moment, so center of mass roughly around here, and base of support we know is that green shaded area in the picture there. So at the moment I'm happy in this position, and I'm happy in this position because my center of mass is nicely within my base of support. So the goal is, if I can keep that position all the way down, I will end up with a completely vertical trunk and be able to keep my barbell above my head. But what happens is, as we start to go down, I very quickly hit my first load of restriction, and my first load of restriction is within my ankles. So this is a restriction into dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion in weight bearing is basically keeping my heels on the floor. How far forward can I get my knees? And my knees are kind of stopping there. So what that means is my center of mass is now going backwards. So center of mass is now traveling down in that position. If it goes outside of my base of support, then I'm just going to fall backwards. I'm going to end up going in that position. So my body, remember, is always playing the game of, can I keep my center of mass in my base of support? So to do that, my trunk starts to lean forward, so my base of support is within my center of mass. So that's why already my trunk is starting to lean forward. As we play the video and I get lower and lower down, I'm going to start to come to my next real big restriction, which is in my hips. So if you look now at my hip flexion angle, like we tried to with Mario's, you'll notice that that hip angle is a lot greater, which means I've got much less hip flexion. So to try to cheat, what my body is going to do, if you look at that area there, is it's going to start to go into posterior rotation of the pelvis to try and give me more hip flexion. The downside of that is posterior rotation of the pelvis is going to try and take my center of mass backwards. Again, if my center of mass comes out of my base of support, I'm going to fall backwards onto my backside. So to prevent that happening, my trunk is now leaning further and further forwards. And the lower I go, that just increases until I end up in this position here. So if you really understand the deep squat, this actually makes sense. So my body's trying to stop me falling over. It's doing the right thing. And to stop me falling over, it has to keep my center of mass within my base of support. And the body is efficient in that it will take the easiest path to do that. So if I've got a restriction somewhere like I have in ankles and hip, it will say, don't worry about that. I'm not going to waste any time and effort going through those tight areas. I'll just move in an adjacent joint that's got more range of motion. So for me, that's my trunk, which is why I'm ending up in this position. This is take 2 of the deep squat, and what we're going to have a look at is what happens when we get a little bit more range of motion in one of those areas of restriction, and we're going to see what happens to my deep squat. So as I'm sure you can see, under the back of my heels, I've put 2 yoga blocks. So not particularly big, just 2 kind of little yoga blocks going to go underneath my heels. And we're going to play the video again, and we're going to see how my deep squat looks this time. So there's my end of range position, and I'm sure you'll agree there's a world of difference between this position and my last video. So this is a much nicer deep squat position. I've got my trunk relatively straight, which means my arms can stay relatively above my head. So if I've got my barbell in that position, I'm going to be able to hold that position quite nicely. So this is a much better looking deep squat. But let's have a look at why all of a sudden, just by putting yoga blocks underneath my ankles, I can now get into a deep squat position. So all these yoga blocks are going to do is give me a little bit more ankle dorsiflexion. So allow my knees to come further forward. So as I come down into this deep squat position, what those yoga blocks are allowing me to do is it's allowing my knees to come further forward. So the further my knees come forward, intuitively, everything else is going to come forward with it. So if everything else is coming forward with it, my center of mass is also coming forwards. So we know if my center of mass is nicely within my base of support, my body's happy from a balance perspective. So the further I can get my center of mass towards the front of my base of support, the more upright I can keep my trunk. And that's what those yoga blocks do. So just by giving yourself a little bit more range of motion of the ankles, it's given me a huge amount of difference in the performance of my deep squat. The other thing I could do, so we've spoken about hip flexion as well, so increasing my hip flexion will also help me get into a deep squat. We've demonstrated that getting a bit more range of motion at the ankles will also help my deep squat. The other thing I can look at doing is trying to increase my hip abduction and external rotation. So what that would look like is just trying to increase the gap in between my legs, so getting my legs out a little bit wider. Because again, intuitively, if I can get my legs going kind of backwards into that position, legs going backwards into that position again means trunk, torso and center of mass is going to be coming forwards, and the further forwards we are into my base of support, the more upright I'm going to be able to keep my trunk. So in summary, the key to understanding the deep squat is to understand this interplay between gravity, base of support and center of mass, and that the key restrictions that I find time and time again are restrictions into hip flexion, hip abduction and hip external rotation, and also ankle dorsiflexion. Now if you're looking to improve any of those variables, then I would recommend going over to one of my previous articles on the website called the 8 best stretches for runners. I'll put a link below, and I'll put a link in on the website link to this video. The stretches come from Kelly Starrett's mobility WOD, so anyone that's interested in CrossFit that hasn't heard of Kelly Starrett, I'd be surprised, but I'm a real big fan of his mobility work, so I've put a few of his stretches in that article, and they're really good ones to do. Now the other thing to note with these stretches and mobility work is if you're starting from a position like myself and your deep squat is similar to mine, then it's going to take you a while to try and transition from where I am to where Mario is, and you're looking at months and months, maybe even years of hard work working at those restrictions consistently and regularly. So that's just important to note, just so your expectations are right. These are not quick fixes when you're as tight as people like me, but as long as you stick to it, you do it diligently, you will be able to get there. Your body will adapt. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope maybe you learned something new today, and I'll look forward to catching up with you soon and putting out a new video.